Hey everybody, in today's example we're going to talk about Redux and show how we can use Redux in our Ionic-3 application. Redux is a predictable state container, and what that means is it's really a store or a central a central container where any part of our application that is interested in a particular piece of state can get access to that. So that might seem a little cryptic, so let's follow up with a quick example. If we were to have a login component and a welcome component, a login component would take a user's email and password and it would log them in, and the welcome page would want to greet them. Maybe it would say something like, "Hi David, welcome back." Now the $1,000,000 question is, how does the welcome component know David's name? Well, the answer really lies in this store right here. This store contains the state of our application. So the user object is a piece of state that lives in our store, and the welcome component, like all other components in our application, have access to this centralized store of information. So this is our source of truth. This diagram does a really good job of explaining the flow in a Redux application. Full disclaimer, this diagram is not mine. I've seen it floating around the web, and I think it does a really good job at explaining the flow of a Redux application. We're not going to go through this right now. I don't want to overwhelm us with all this new vocabulary and understanding what each of these pieces means and what they do. So we're going to keep referring back to this as we're writing our application. So I'm going to set up a blank Ionic project and install some dependencies. I'll be back in just a second and we'll go through all of that. So we've started a blank Ionic project, and there are three libraries that we installed. We installed the ngrx effects library, the ngrx router store, and the ngrx store library. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to write an application that is going to simulate a user login, and we're going to actually implement the example that we spoke about earlier. We're going to have a login page and we're going to have a welcome page. When a user logs in, we are going to have the welcome page welcome the user using their first and last name. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to create two pages. So we have the home page. We'll have that be our welcome page. We'll rename this, and then we will create a login page. All right, so we have created this login page over here. This login.html is just your standard template. It has a username and a password as input fields. This is where the user is going to go and type in their username and password. They'll click login. They'll click a button that says login. If we detect an alert, we will say invalid credentials. Very vanilla login page over here. The login component is empty. It does reference the new template we created. Homepage hasn't really changed. We just changed the message here. It just says welcome. As we begin implementing, we will go in and say we'll do something like this. But for now, we'll just keep it empty. So let's start by let's delve into Redux. So the way I like to do things is I create a directory with the type of sort of state that I'm dealing with. So if we say user, I create a directory called user, and we can begin by creating a user model. So we'll go here and we'll say user.ts, and we'll say export an interface user. It'll have an ID of type string, a first name, a last name, and an email. So now that we've defined our user model, let's think in terms of the UI. So in Redux, your UI dispatches, and this is where we're going to go back to our diagram. So if we go to our diagram over here, we can see that our state defines the UI, which makes sense, right? The state really tells us how pages and different components are going to present themselves. Now, the UI triggers these things called actions. So in this context, so if we're going to go back to the IDE, this context, this login page, right? This login page, what kind of actions is it going to trigger? Well, we're going to have a click event, which should call a login function. And that is your action right there. So that's your clue, is sort of what events, what are the things that this component is going to fire off and do? Well, it's going to need to log in the user. So let's just stub out that function. Okay, we have login. So this login function is going to trigger some sort of action. We'll go back here. So this, our UI, is going to trigger an action. So actions are really just things that we're going to fire off. And what we'll do is we're going to create a file called user.reducer.ts. We're going to go and create a few action types, right? What are the types of actions that, what are the types of actions that the UI is going to create, and what are the things we need to consider? Well, the user could log in. That's one action. Another action is the user, we're going to get a different type of action, which is a success or an error. That depends on whether the username and password combination is correct or not. So we'll go here. And I think for now, these are the 3 types of actions that we need to take into account. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to define our state. So we'll create. Oh, okay. Thanks, Alexa. So what we're going to do is we're going to define our state, and we'll have really the user, right? So the user definitely needs to be here. In this example, we're going to have pieces of state in the user state that I don't think really belong here. Namely, we'll have a loading Boolean. This will tell us if the HTTP request is in flight or not, and an error message, or rather an error status. So this will be a true/false Boolean, so that we can show this error message right here. And the reason I don't think that these belong in the user state is these are something to do, these really have something to do, not with anything with the user, but really with HTTP requests. So, ideally these would be in something called app state or something like that. But because this is just a small example, we're gonna just stuff that in the user state, that's fine. So let's go ahead and this is our interface. Let's create the initial state. So what is our initial state gonna look like? So loading will be false, error will be false, and our user will be null. We won't have a user at the beginning. So we've defined our initial state, we've defined our actions. So we've defined our actions, we've defined our state. Let's take a step back and let's think about our store. We're going to refer back to the diagram. So this store contains all of our state. So what we need to do is we're going to need to create a store that's going to contain this user state right here. So to do that, we're going to hop into this app directory, create a new file, app.store.ts. We'll say export interface app store, and it will have a user state of type user state. And this now is our store. Now, as if we had more components, we could have something like profile state, right? We could have something like settings state, and I think you get the idea. So every state that we define is going to live here, and this store is going to be accessible by our components. They can go and subscribe to these different pieces of state in order to get the relevant information. So what we're going to do in our login component is inject that store. So we will do something like private store store with the App Store, right? Making these private, and we'll put that comma. Looks like, let's see what happened here. There we go. Okay, so now we have our store, which we are going to dispatch events to, right? So when somebody clicks on the login button, we are going to send an action to our store. So we're gonna go here, we'll say private. We need to create the variables that are gonna bind to those text boxes. Okay, so if you go here, you'll see that we had these guys on the ng model, username and password, and this is the login function. So in the login function, when somebody clicks it, we're going to do this .store .dispatch a new login action, this .username, this .password. Now we didn't define the login action yet, so let's go ahead and do that. We're going to go back to our user.reducer.ts file, and over here, this is where we're going to define that login action. So export class login action of type action. Okay, and this action, and we'll just import, this action is actually coming from our ngrx store. Okay, so it implements that interface. Anything when you see implements, it's actually an interface. So we'll define a type by default. We'll say, well, if it's a login action, we're going to say you are doing a user login. You'll have a user eventually, and you'll have a Boolean value. We'll have a constructor. That constructor will have a username, and it will also have a password. Oops. Okay, and this action now is going to get dispatched. So we're going to go here, and we can now import this. All right, and this is just the autocomplete functionality in my IDE. So we have taken this login action from our reducer. When a user clicks the login button, we go into this function and we dispatch an event to our store. So taking a look here, actions are sent to a reducer, but we don't have a reducer yet. So let's go back and now write our reducer. Now the next thing we want to do is write our reducer. So if we go back to the diagram, we can see that actions are triggered by the UI and they're sent to a reducer. So I'm going to write the reducer route, and we are going to step through it line by line. So this is our reducer over here, and you can see that it takes a state as its first input, and we've defined an initial state for the first time this reducer is run. It also takes a login action. The next thing we do is we run through the type of action that this is. So if this is a user login success, or user login error, the state that we return is different. So you can see here, we say loading is true if we get a user login action. User login success means that we fired the HTTP request, it was successful, so we're no longer loading, and we're going to return the user. And finally, if we get a user login error action, loading is again false because the HTTP request fired, it was not successful, and we're saying error is true. And this is what's going to trigger this message right here. Now, if we get an action type that we don't recognize, so it's not one of these three, we're just going to return the current state. We're not going to do anything to it. It's important to note that we are creating a new state using this syntax and adding adding an extra variable or two to it. Something like this is not allowed. So if we wanted to do state.loading equals true and then return that state, that is actually not allowed because we cannot manipulate the state at all. We are only allowed to return the new state. So that is, these reducers should be very simple functions that return a new state and don't alter the existing state.